Hi, I'm Sean Cantwell, and this is the new Scaling Success podcast. We started Scaling Success to provide a space for entrepreneurs and business leaders to discuss the important topics that contribute to building a valuable and long-lasting enterprise, and to juxtapose our view as investors with that of entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs who are on the front lines. Episodes are now on Spotify. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by none other than Paul Melchiorre, the guy who literally wrote the book on software sales, as he recently authored Selling the Cloud, a playbook for success in cloud software and enterprise sales. In doing so, he drew upon his 30 years of experience in enterprise software sales and business leadership, tracing back to the early days of Ariba. That led to senior leadership roles at SAP, iPipeline, former Volition Capital portfolio company, quick plug, and most recently, Anaplan. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sean, it's my pleasure. Really excited to talk with your team today.
All right, terrific. Paul, I want to start from the beginning before we dive into some particular topics. And I should start by saying, I'm really excited to have you on today because I think one of the most common questions we get from entrepreneurs is, when is my business ready to step on the gas and scale the sales organization, and how do we do that? We're going to get to that, but I want to start from the beginning. I was reading through your book last night, and I took note that your bio describes you as a natural-born salesman from South Philly with street smarts and entrepreneurial drive. And I want to hear you tell us a little bit more about that, because I think many of us think salespeople are born. And I'm curious, do you think, are you born a salesperson, or can you learn how to be a salesperson? But take us back to the beginning.
It's a good question, Sean. And my mom tells me, and I don't really remember this because I think I was 4 years old, but she said came home with all this money, and it was only, a few nickels, but I was charging the kids on the street to draw stick figures. And I charged them 5 cents back then. And she said, you got to give that money back. So I don't know if that was just a natural salesperson in me, but then soon after that, I think my first sales job was about 11 or 12 years old, selling newspapers on the beach down in the Jersey Shore. And, it's really been in my blood. So for me, I kind of thought, growing up in the city, trying to make extra money, selling was one of the ways to do it. And so for me, it was from the very beginning. But I think today, salespeople, it's a combination. They're born, and there's leadership qualities and sales qualities in people, but it's become more science now. You really have to work at it.
Yep. I love that your first job was selling newspapers. I don't know if you know this, Paul, but that was also my first job, the Allentown Morning Call. Shout out Allentown, PA. But Paul, I mentioned in the intro, that you have 30 years of enterprise software sales. I think the manner and the way in which software is sold has evolved quite a bit. And I think our audience is probably most interested in some of the tactics and ways to drive effectiveness today. But I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to kind of just hear your perspective on how software sales has evolved over the last 30 years.
And it's really been changing. We put the book together, and, we said, we can't really publish it because now COVID, everything's going to change. The reality is, when we look back, all these things that happened were changing over the last 10 years anyway. I mean, enterprise selling has changed. The whole movement to SaaS software changed the way we sold, very different than my selling in the early SAP days of the late 80s, early 90s. There's some things obviously to stand the test of time when it comes to selling. But I think today, you're right, it's very much evolved and it's very different. But some of the things that have stayed the same are, and they're outlined in the book. It's the ability to ensure that we have, a very strong relationship with our prospective customers. I write also that some of these customers I sold 3, 4, 5 times over 30 years. They go from company to company to company. If you maintain those relationships, you basically can sell them time and time again, whether you're at the same company or they're at a different company. So some of those things haven't changed over the years, but I think what's dramatically accelerated is the ability to adopt, right? I mean, the buyer has changed. I actually gave a presentation when I was at Ariba about, the buying habits changing. The buyers are so much smarter today, especially in these larger enterprises. They have access to more information and most likely are more familiar about your company than your salespeople are, because of the research they can do. They've been doing this for 20 or 30 years as buyers. They know what they're doing. And then you get a relatively inexperienced salesperson coming into the enterprise. A lot of times they come in, they don't have the information, don't know enough about the company, and the buyers realize that quickly. So I could probably sum it up that what's changed, you got to do a lot more homework in enterprise sales now before you meet your prospects.
Yep. And you touched on trust-based selling, which I think is so critical. And we see this across our portfolios. And I think that's a challenge for new salespeople to kind of understand that. And I'm curious what advice you provide to up and coming sales folks as it relates to building that trust with your customers, which, as you mentioned, leads to follow on sales potential, whether that be at your current company or down the road.
Exactly, Sean. And I think a lot of sales folks get into this and their mindset is transaction.
Yep.
Right. I got a quota. I got to hit my quota. I'm going to get fired. I got to get a deal. And they take a very short-term transactional view of the profession. And that's where the trust gets eroded very quickly, because customers sense that, they feel it. If you care about your customer, you build that trusted relationship. Whether you sell them in this particular transaction or not is really irrelevant, because you're building that long-term relationship and long-term trust.
That's great. I mentioned, Paul, at the outset that we get a lot of questions in our capacity as a venture capital firm when we're talking to prospective investments, portfolio companies, entrepreneurs, and they'll ask, when is it time for me to really step on the gas and scale this thing? And I'm sure you get asked that question quite a bit, given your experience and your broad network. And I'm curious how you would answer that question.
Sean, sometimes, the natural reaction when you get the check from the venture firm, and I've made the mistake and lived with it, is, you want to hit that gas immediately, right? And you don't realize you might be, heading in the wrong direction with the car, or you might be heading off a cliff. And the biggest example I see more recently, because there's so much money out there, is that they get this money and they say, okay, we've got to go scale the sales organization, without understanding segmentation, how they're going to manage their territories, how they're going to pay the people, the compensation structures, the whole go-to-market might not be well thought out, enablement, how am I going to train these folks? What kind of support infrastructure am I going to put in place? Oh, by the way, is the product really ready for all this additional, potential business? So I think, you have to take a multi-pronged approach. And obviously, if you've got the good product market fit, that chances are you could hit the gas. But I think before you just start adding reps and in a spreadsheet format, which a lot of people do, you really have to think about the overall go-to-market function, and making sure the other supporting elements are in place before you just go out and hire a bunch of reps.
Yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, many bootstrap founder-owned businesses, you have one entrepreneur wearing multiple hats. In the early days, they are the salesperson. They might be the product engineer as well, and the chief dishwasher and everything else in between. So, many times when a company raises capital, the first thing they say is, hey, I want to go out and hire a professional salesperson, a chief revenue officer, a VP of sales. And you mentioned this evolution of, art meets science in selling. And I'm curious, if you were an entrepreneur and you were interviewing for that first head of sales, what are the qualities and characteristics you're looking for in that person?
Yeah, in fact, there's actually a whole section on hiring salespeople, which in some ways is a little different maybe than hiring the leadership position. So I'll kind of just preface that. But there's certain characteristics that you look for, especially in early stage companies. I think if you're in a larger firm, you're looking for a lot of operational experience and checking of the boxes. But I think in most of our portfolio companies, specifically at Abolition or other firms, these are younger stage companies, or they're bootstrap companies, and they're typically hiring that first or second sales executive. And I think the title CRO is probably the wrong, kind of job description, because at that stage, you really don't need a CRO. You need somebody to really build out the sales organization, which could be called a CRO, a head of sales, whatever you want to call it. But they have to have a certain skill set. And what I typically look for is, can they roll up their sleeves and get stuff done, right? Because as an entrepreneur or a CEO who's built it and was that head of sales, was the product visionary, they're going to look back and say, okay, now I'm handing this over. Do I step back? No, hopefully not. So they're going to have to bring somebody in that really truly is a partner, not just to build out the operational aspects of the company. That's important, don't get me wrong, but they got to be able to roll up their sleeves and get those first big next deals done, help work on the price model, help work on all the things that we talked about maybe a little bit earlier about those things that have to be in place and go to market before you scale. That's something that you want to have that new first leader be able to put in place. And that may not necessarily be the sales leader that takes you to IPO or to the next level in the company. And I see a lot of early stage companies, especially bootstrap companies, I'll say go in and overhire that first sales leader. And I got a great example. I won't name the company, but they brought in this big shot from SAP. And, 6 months later, he's not delivering. And, at the board level, it's tough because you can't just go in and say that guy's no good, which I knew. So I said, can I take a look? And this is pre-COVID, Sean. Can I take a look at his expense reports? And the CEO was like, well, why would you want to see his expense report? I want to see if he's ever out of the office. Oh, he's never out of it. He's always in the office. All he does is look at Salesforce and hit refresh to hope maybe that the forecast gets better. Never was out in front of customers, didn't really understand the product. The salespeople didn't want to, even work with him. So it was a big mistake. We wasted 6 to 9 months. And, it wasn't somebody that could come in and roll up the sleeves and get stuff done. So that's what I look for in that early stage sales leader, in most of the companies that we would be funding at Felicia.
That's a really interesting point, Paul. And, it's kind of cliche for people to label folks as, oh, they're a big company or they're a small company. I'm curious if you've seen people along the way that have been able to kind of bridge that gap and be a big company executive, but then immerse themselves in the startup culture and roll up their sleeves and be that player coach.
Yeah, I mean, I not to, embellish my career, but that's been my career, right? I mean, if I think about SAP, everybody knows it as a giant company. Well, when we started behind me here in Philly in 1990, 91, I don't want to date myself, but it's a long time ago, we were 100 employees. So we were a small company. Yeah, and then, I was running sales there, it was multi-billion dollars. So a lot of times you can, and I know the CRO at Snowflake, Chris, great guy, was salesperson number 1. Now he's the CRO. That is not typical. There are very, very few of those folks, because if you think about the specialties and the skill sets that are required at the different stages of a company, you're probably not going to be good at all of them. I could assure you. And for me, I grew into the SAP job and I had no formalized training. And gosh, I learned so many, things during that time period, but the success of the company masked a lot of mistakes. So I think it's very hard to do that. Now, there are some big company people that, relish the fact that they want to get, into the weeds and roll their sleeves up and have an impact, because they know they're not really having an impact at the large company. And they do have the work ethic and ability to do it. They're harder to find, but if you can find one of those that has the exposure to larger companies, but the grit and determination and ability to pioneer in a small company, that's a perfect profile.
There's a section in the book, Paul, that talks about different types of salespeople. And in some ways, I guess that suggests that different types of people can be successful in sales.
Right.
And I'm just curious to kind of get your perspective, given that if you're the hiring manager and you're trying to build out a team of performers that are going to hit their number, how do you think through that process? And what advice would you provide to sales leaders out there that are living that right now?
Yeah. And I think, there's like the lone wolf, the challengers, and by the way, it's just like anything else. It's your style, right? It's your personality. And you're absolutely right, Sean. I think any and all of those can be very successful or not successful. So it's just a different kind of lens that you view the profession as. And I think if you try to get all of one type of rep, that's not good either, right? Because you want that diversity. And I don't mean diversity in the, today's sense of, diversity, although there is a whole section on why women in SaaS selling are like killing it. And at Anaplan, we had a ton of, women who were a very similar profile, and they just all were incredibly successful because they fit a certain way of dealing with customers that, they weren't just in it for the quick hit. They challenged, they weren't, lone wolf. Some of them were, but, they just really were very successful. And when I looked across our sales organization and I started looking at the different categories, and we didn't make that up. That's, we stole that from somebody, I think. But, every one of those categories we had, right? Whether it was by accident, I think it was, I'll take credit for it now, but, we had such a diversity of the different types of profiles of reps that they each challenged each other. They all supported each other. They were competitive, which is good, right? And so I think hiring good people to be professional, regardless of the style, right? Because I don't think one is better than another. Maybe for a certain culture and organization, you could start to fit them. But if you start thinking in your hiring process, oh my God, I have to have all lone wolves because I want, or I want all challengers. That's not what we meant to approach it. It's just these people could be successful regardless of the profile, regardless of the style, let's say. And it doesn't mean that one is better than another. It's just, at least if you know what you're dealing with, it helps you, say, as a manager, on how to deal with that potential profile. And we talk a lot about like the profiling, if you will, the quadrants, the Myers-Briggs, all these different, kind of psychological approaches to sales, which I'm a big believer in. All that says is doesn't mean one is better than the other. It just allows you to figure out what you're dealing with.
Yep. There was one section in the book, Paul, that jumped out to me, and it talked about the power of positive thinking in sales. And, I think it said that in order to flourish, we need 3 positive thoughts for every 1 negative thought. And I think that's probably good advice for anyone in any line of work. Yeah. But I'm curious how that mindset perhaps translates specifically to sales.
Yeah, and we got a lot of support in the book from our titans in this whole mindset concept. And I didn't realize, honestly, how important it was until I started doing the research. And I always had, I called it a glass half full attitude, yep. Right? And it was pretty just simple. It's like you could either get too high on the highs, too low on the lows, and you're going to drive yourself crazy in selling, because not every day is a good day, right? Not every day's Friday, although today's Friday, it's a beautiful day. Not every day's Friday, right? There are some Monday mornings you have to deal with. And I think if you have the attitude going in, and I equate a lot of this to sports too, in that, the teams that you see successful year after year after year, now we don't have a lot of them here in Philly, you might have some up your way, but they just have some things in common. And what they have is that, drive and passion for success, but they also have a mindset, and a mindset that doesn't change, right? They're always positive. They always look at the positive views. Regardless of what negative happens, they're always turning it into a learning experience and a positive. And if you think about selling, that's really what we do in selling. If we don't do that, I learn more from deals we lost over the years than deals we won, right? Now, you can get upset and cry about the deals you lost, or you can learn and make sure you don't lose the next time. And so that, to me, is that mindset. And there's all kind of techniques that, people use, and, meditation and yoga, whatever turns you on as far as getting you in that right mindset, because the customer senses the mindset that you're in. And if you go into these transactions, into these relationships, into these selling opportunities with a bad mindset, the results are probably going to be bad, because your customers will know.
I'm curious how that translates to being a sales leader. And I'm thinking about, your earlier point about art and science. And I'm thinking about, on the one hand, you're the chief motivator, the leader, the half glass full guy. But at the same time, you are accountable to results, and you got to drive accountability through the organization. And I'm curious, clearly you managed to strike that balance. And I don't know if it was, just kind of subconscious for you, or if there was any, kind of intentional things you did along the way to be that leader and motivator that, tells the organization they can accomplish that goal while also driving accountability. So it's a little bit of the carrot and the stick, I guess.
Yeah. And I think, Sean, that's really what, in my opinion, distinguishes a lot of the leaders, right? So first of all the things I just talked about around mindset are magnified as you go up in the organization, right? So it's like, never let them see you sweat, right? Or whatever those things are. So it's always positive in front of the sales team. It's always motivating. It's always the glass is more than half full. Now, of course, when it comes to accountability, or when you're negotiating with your CEO or the CFO, you might be a little more scientific about the approach.
Yep.
And then I think when it comes to the stick component, I've always looked at, and I've fired a lot of people, and sometimes they deserved it, and sometimes maybe, we did it, too early, but we always did it with dignity, and we always did it with accountability, right? And I think when you hire somebody as a sales leader, you have to build a sales culture that is a winning culture, right? That is a culture of accountability, because then it makes it a lot easier. People know they're coming in, and it isn't a country club. There's no, PPP loans and free lunch, right? This is, you are accountable to shareholders, investors, your customers, and you have to act responsibly. And if you don't, then, you're going to get fired, right? I mean, and people need to understand that. And I don't have a problem letting people go, especially when the team around says, you know what, I'm glad they fired him or her, because it actually sometimes motivates the team. Now, if you fire somebody for the wrong reasons, that's a whole different situation and very negative, which I never thought I did in my career, because I made sure I gave people at least a second chance. Unless they did something unethical, then they didn't get a second chance. But like, okay, they're so many months into a quota, they're not hitting quota, their pipeline's not there. What can we do to try to make this person successful, right? They know the accountability, right? And if they don't deliver after that, at least I can sleep at night and say, you know what, I gave that individual a chance. They didn't do it. So when I came into Anaplan, for example, we had, I think, 26 quota carrying reps doing about 30 million in 2016. And the rep profile was not good. They hired a bunch of product type folks. So out of the 26, I think we fired 13, but I didn't do it all at once, right? We had a waiting period. We actually went through a whole process. We got input from the pre-sales people who are invaluable in determining this stuff. And then we got rid of some we knew that we're never going to make it. Then we put a few on plan, some just left. And I want to say now, today, there's probably 4 or 5 of those original people that are incredibly successful, that were on my firing list. So they were able to kind of, see the accountability, the change in the culture that was coming, and wanted to be part of it, had the skills. Maybe they were too lazy. Maybe they didn't, had other issues going on, but they literally turned it around and are incredibly successful today because of it. So I think giving them that extra opportunity and chance, that builds the right culture. That is motivating. That's the right mindset. But if they're still not delivering, you got responsibility to shareholders and everyone else.
Paul, that's a great segue to a topic I'd love to get your perspective on. In our seat at Volition Capital, we're investing in primarily, capital efficient, high growth tech businesses that are raising capital because they've have that established product market fit, and they now really want to step on the gas and scale sales and marketing and grab market share. I think what everyone wants to avoid in that process is the 80-20 rule, which I think plagues every single sales organization on the planet to some degree, where 20% of your reps are driving at least 80%, if not more, of the productivity. That's certainly the case when you have small sales teams, less than 5 reps. There's usually one kind of outlier performer. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, in your journeys at many stops along the way over multiple decades, have you figured out how to crack that code of, getting broad distributed performance across a big team? And if so, are there any words of wisdom on how to get there?
Yeah, no, and I think I've gotten some pretty good success because it's hard, right? The sales reps that are there that are very successful, the first thing they're going to tell you when you come in as a new leader is, oh, I'm not giving up any of these accounts, right? or this is my territory. And, so you really have to look at it holistically and say, okay, are the territories balanced properly? Because the majority of these times, you got a lot of really inadequate salespeople coming in and out that have the crappy accounts. Some of them just are bad salespeople, but you really have to look and say, okay, I've got to get a better balanced performance. It can't be an 80-20 or 90-10. It's got to be like 60 to 70% of the reps are contributing to the revenue, because if not, you can't scale. And you have to make some tough decisions. I remember even early Anaplan days, where there was a handful of incredible reps. And, like I said, a lot of them were female. So they were very tough. And it was hard for me personally to go in and tell them, look, I'm taking you from 20 accounts to 10 or 20 to 5. Those conversations were very, very difficult, but we had to do it. And by the way, what really made the other reps successful, we did enablement and other things that were important, and proper ratios with sales to pre-sales and business development. But the reality is, by better organizing the territories and sharing the wealth in the territories amongst a broader set of reps, really allowed us to grow and grow much quicker and grow the successful number of reps. Now, we did some creative things with the reps, especially because I was afraid of them. I said, look, I'll give you an override on these deals over the next 6 months if you work with these younger, newer reps. So it was kind of bribery, I guess, but it actually did work. And, I think to this day, and some of them are actually mentioned in the book, where the smaller territory allowed one of the ladies to just focus on these really large deals. And she had her biggest year, after she gave those accounts up, because she was able to penetrate in these accounts much deeper. And then therefore all the other accounts she gave up, but she really wasn't working, newer, younger reps came in and actually got a lot of business out of. So it's not an easy thing to do, because the natural tendency is to give all the good leads to your best reps, right? Because you don't lose the opportunities, but you really have to figure out how to distribute the territories appropriately in those early stages, or you're really going to wind up with the 80-20 rule.
I'm curious, Paul, what your take is on where renewals and upsell should live within a sales organization. And, I think you get to a certain scale where the company is large enough and you can create a division of labor. In young, high growth companies, it's this constant battle back and forth between hunters and farmers. And how do you appropriately service the customer while also extracting, value over time? And I'm curious if you've learned any lessons on that topic along the way.
Yeah, when I got to Anaplan, we didn't have customer success. I mean, we didn't have hunters and farmers. We had a bunch of hunters. And then those hunters would start farming. But if, like I give you the example, they had so many accounts, they were leaving a lot of patch unfarmed, right? So you really have to look at, what is your go-to-market and what stage the company is in, because there's different models that apply, but just think of them as knobs, right? If your salespeople are truly hunting and your product market fit is still a little immature, but trying to get mature, so you want to get these new customers, then all the effort should be put into new, right? Now, whether the farming aspect is done by a different group or is supporting the salesperson, it really is dependent. But I think you have to start to think about what is best for the customer to ensure the customer success, which at the end of the day, we need our customers. Maybe not the short-term revenue as much, but I know that's tough because you have that other knob. But I think the reality is, if you can partition that kind of selling effort and say, okay, there are people that are really good at selling and they can stay in these accounts and continue to farm them, right? It also depends on your product too. If my product is so unique that, or it's a platform where you can go into one division and sell it, and it doesn't sell itself to the other division or the other line of business, then you probably have to have hunters continuing along in those accounts. And I think that's what we had at Anaplan. We realized pretty quickly, you couldn't have a hunter go in, sell into supply chain, and then assume that the finance people were going to buy. In fact, it was the opposite. It was even harder. It was like doing a new deal, other than we had a contract vehicle in place. So I think it depends on the complexity of your product, who it's being sold to in the accounts, and then, the profile of your reps. Some reps are just born hunters. And you know what? When you try to get them to farm, they're less good at hunting, not as good as farming, and your productivity and sales efficiency goes down. So understand the profile of the people that you have and make sure they're put in the right profile. And that may actually dictate, Sean, setting up, especially in the interim until you scale, overlay positions that, maybe are considered farmers. I hate to use the word farmers, but an earlier stage of customer success, which really isn't a delivery person, but kind of maybe a more technical sales or pre-sales type that can come after the hunter comes in and assist in that farming process, and make sure your compensation is aligned. Because one of the big mistakes a lot of young companies make in that transition is, okay, I got hunters, farmers, and none of the comp plans align, right? And then you got all this overlap and infighting, and who suffers? The customer, and then eventually you do. So I think make sure the comp plans are aligned, make sure it's clearly identifiable roles, and then I think just don't over think where you're at in the stage of your life cycle as a company. So I see a lot of these younger companies, oh, we have to hire a head of customer success and build this huge customer success organization to deal with all the renewals. Well, you don't have enough new business yet to worry about the renewals. So make sure you think about where you're at in the stage and act appropriately.
I'm curious if there's a rule of thumb on how you think about staffing a team. And what I mean by that is, sales can be a higher turnover functional area within an organization, because there are some folks that just won't hit their number and they're not getting paid, and as a result we'll move on. And that's another question that folks will ask, is there any advice on, if I'm trying to hit a quota of X and I need Y productive reps to get there, how should we think about it? And we'll often say, overhire by 2 or 3 to assume there'll be some churn. And I'm curious,
unfortunately, that's
exercised many times. Like, do you have a rule of thumb on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's our business, right? I always look at it, it's between like 15% is my kind of gut number, but it's pretty statistically accurate when you look over time. It depends on the size of companies, but just assume that in selling enterprise software, your turnover is going to be between 10 and 20%, no matter what, right? It's just the nature of the business. There's so many companies out there. People aren't going to hit the number. They're just going to leave. So, I had this conversation with one of the firms that I work with about hiring, and they really just didn't hire enough folks. And then they had turnover, and they're like, now we're not at our sales capacity. So as a sales manager, you always have to be recruiting. And I think a lot of companies, especially early stage companies, they don't have the recruiting engine built, even if it's external, that kind of engine working where if I need 10 reps, well, maybe I should be recruiting for 15, understanding I'm going to get to 10, maybe I hire 12, and then 2 or 3 are going to fall out. If you don't think and work your models like that, Sean, you're going to be behind. And then when you're behind, you're always behind, right? So it just seems like it's a flywheel. You don't catch up. So I think earlier on in the cycle, plan on at least 15% or more. That's just going to fall out. It's just the way it is. I mean, it's a numbers game, and you got to play the numbers. Now, obviously, there's things you could do to better enable, to lower your turnover rate, but you just got to assume that in the profession that we're in the competitive environment that we're dealing with, you're going to lose 15+% of the folks, and even some of your best ones are going to leave. So if you're not prepared for that, you're going to be behind. And I would just tell the sales leaders, and especially the frontline managers, more so, they always should be recruiting. And by the way, if they come across an amazing candidate and you don't have a head count, I guarantee you, as a board member of one of your volition companies, somebody comes to me and says, I got a great rep. Can we increase our spend here? Because I think I've got somebody that I know we're going to support it.
Great. I'm curious, Paul, to get your take on like the balance of sales and product in an organization and how they complement each other ultimately to drive success. And the question is really one of how much of performance is driven by good sales tactics versus a good product. And the follow-on question is, how have you seen that feedback loop work effectively, where the sales folks who are out there talking to the customers, hearing what they're looking for, hearing the pushback, really interact with the product folks in a way that you ultimately are going to market with a product that is meeting needs and delivering value?
That's a great series of questions, Sean. And I think I'll take the first one. Obviously, if you have a crappy product, even if you have the best sales organization in the world, it's going to catch up to you. So that's not a good situation. And you can have the best product and a bad sales organization, and I think of that as a wasted opportunity. So really the two are so intertwined. I think more importantly, your second question is so critical, especially today, because of the acceleration of development, the new companies, all you need is a credit card and an Amazon account, and you're starting a company. So with that, I've always looked at our pre-sales folks as so critical in that process. And think about it. They're on the front line with the account reps. They're credible with the engineering and product organization because they're pretty technical. And that to me has always been the best feedback loop, because in most younger companies, they don't have an advanced product marketing, product management organization, right? They may have a technical founder, who has a product vision, who heads engineering, who was heading sales before they brought the salesperson in. So it's really hard, to have that formal feedback loop like a larger organization. So that feedback loop has to happen because it's just people on the ground that are demoing the product every day, that are in front of the customers, that are there and saying, oh, this product's great, but it's really missing these things. And if you had these things, I would buy it. Well, that's invaluable to feedback, to the product organization. So I always saw that the pre-sales people were the glue in that kind of feedback loop, especially in early stage companies. And I always say, overinvest in pre-sales early stage company, because they make your mediocre salespeople better, and they definitely can replace your product management organization until you get one.
That's great. Paul, you've had success at a variety of different organizations. So from the outside, you could look at that and say, Paul was the missing ingredient that drove success in that organization. And I'm sure that there's an element of that. But I think it also speaks to your ability to see opportunity, and then kind of align your skills in those situations to help drive success. And I'm curious, I'm sure you get a lot of questions from sales folks looking for their next opportunity. I know you've mentored a lot of people over the course of your career, and I'm sure they hit you up. What advice do you provide to sales reps on what they should be looking for in their next spot? And what are the types of questions they should be asking in order to really make a well-informed decision?
Yeah, and Sean, I do a lot of that, and I really enjoy it because it's my way of giving back. And if I look back at my career, I got to admit a lot of it was being in the right place at the right time and then taking advantage of it, right? I mean, here at SAP in the 90s, nobody knew what it was. It was a German mainframe software company. And if it probably wasn't in Philly, I would have never made the move. So you got to be good, you got to be lucky and take advantage of it. But I think the questions you got to ask, especially today, because there's so many companies out there, right? Where are they on that product market fit, right? Because I think that's when you and I, evaluate a portfolio company for investment, that's probably the first thing we're looking at, right? Is what is the product market fit? Because I probably could fix the sales organization or the go-to-market or whatever, but I probably can't fix the product market fit. So that's what I tell, prospective sales folks going into these opportunities. What is that product market fit, right? And if it's there or if it's about to be there, then that's great. The second one is how big is the opportunity, right? Because if it's a good product market fit, but the TAM is small, you still can make money, but it's maybe limited. And then third, and probably most importantly, I tell these folks, what is the culture that you're going into and what impact do you think you can have, right? Are you going into a culture that you're just not going to be happy with, even if it's, lucrative financially, and then you're going to have a miserable time? Or I really like the people, I get along with the CEO, I like the culture, it's a fun environment, that's, I think they're the three things to me that really make the difference. Is it the product market fit, big opportunity from a TAM perspective? And if you can assess the culture, and that's a whole probably series of questions you need to ask, a lot of, background checks, et cetera. But that's what I tell these folks to do, because you can make a big mistake leaving a pretty good job, because chances are these are very successful sales leaders, sales reps, whatever, that are in a position where they're making good money. They're being courted by multiple companies, and they're thinking about making that move. If they don't ask those questions, they could wind up making a mistake. And a lot of folks have done that. They just jump the jump and, they don't really think it through. But, they're the three things I think if you can nail those down, the product market fit, the TAM, and then, your ability to fit into that culture. If those three things are there, chances are it's going to be a good fit.
Got it. I'm curious, what advice would you give to a young Paul Melchiorre?
Well, if I had to go back and do it again, I probably should have took the Workday job in 2008 when they had about 40 or 50 employees. I, for whatever reason, I just said, PeopleSoft, it's just going to be in the cloud. How could that ever be anything?
Yeah, this cloud thing, that's a fad.
Yeah, that cloud thing. I mean, this was in mid 2000s, so it was a while back. I think what I didn't do there, and I have a lot of those examples, is, really do the homework when you're looking at these different things. I think we as salespeople tend to, always go with our gut, right? And the emotion drives us because we're all that type of people. And, today I think there's just so much more analytics that are involved. And at the same time, I wouldn't do all the analytics because that's not right either. But if you could figure out that blend of art and science, because that's what our profession is now. And if I would have known that 10 or 15 years ago, I'd probably have been a lot better at what I did. So I think if you're going into it today, these younger folks that are, and by the way, if you're a young potential sales professional today, it's a great time to be in this profession. It really is. I mean, if you think about enterprise selling, it's really geared towards the younger professionals. I mean, the way we communicate, the way we interact, all the things, the new way of selling, it really just fits the younger person's profile. Not to say us old guys still can't do it, but I think for folks today, if I look at the opportunities, if you're, out of college a few years, it's your first sales job, God, this is a great business to be in. The time couldn't be better. Just make sure you read the book so you understand what you're doing.
Of course. I mean, you make an interesting point. It's a great industry. There's a lot of kind of macro trends driving growth. You have a section in the book that talks about crisis. I think a lot of folks, the younger generation, they haven't lived through a crisis yet in terms of, kind of market crisis. COVID, I guess I should say March and April of last year were pretty scary, but the market rebounded nicely. So I would encourage up and coming sales reps to read that section on crisis, because I think there's a lot of lessons learned dealing with difficult situations. But my question for you, Paul, we started off the conversation, gave a little background on you, the street smart kid from Philly selling newspapers on the Jersey Shore. Now you wrote a book, and I'm curious, what did you learn in that process? What was that process like of sitting down to write a book and kind of try and encapsulate your life's work and a lot of the lessons learned along the way?
It was probably, Sean, the hardest thing I've ever did in my life, right? I mean, first of all, I have a hard time reading, let alone writing, right? So for me, it was a big challenge. I had all these notes. I used to have these old school books where I would, I never brought a computer to the meeting. First of all, I see people pull these computers up and, you don't know if you're on some site or, whatever you're doing, right? So I would always bring a notebook, right? An old school leather notebook. And I had all the empty, the empty pamphlets for like 10 years. I never threw them out, right?
Yep.
And my wife would say, throw that stuff out. I'm like, nah, I'm going to write a book someday. And then, I just decided after I left Anaplan, maybe I'll just go through this stuff and I'll write a book. So I took all these notes and went through these 10 plus years of notes. And then I just couldn't do it on my own because I just didn't know what to do, right? I mean, I ran across my co-author, Mark, and he says, oh my God, this is great. I've been doing the same thing. I got these notes. We should, do this thing together. And within a 30-minute conversation, it all came together, right? Because we had such overlap and our experiences together. And, we had reconnected after like 15 or 20 years. But it was actually then easier after that until I had to figure out, what's the design, and do you self-publish? Do you get a publisher? I was like, it was painful, just picking out the color palettes. I mean, it's blue. No, it's this blue versus that blue. It was insane. So, I mean, it was just really tough. And then we had to take literally 3 or 4 sizes of the book and get it down to this, because I said, look, we cannot have this 500-page book for salespeople because they have a very short attention, especially myself, right? So I said, it's got to be, no pictures, very simple, no big words. we literally had to take 500 pages down to like 200 and something. So that was also very difficult because we had to leave a lot of stuff out, which maybe there'll be a second book, but it was so hard to do this one. And then of course, when we want to go through the book tour and do all the things that you need to do to promote the book, COVID hit. So, a big chunk of it would have been the universities and book tours and sales meetings and things like that. So, that maybe someday we can relaunch it, but it was a great experience. And I'm just so happy the way it turned out, because there were so many times along the process that I just wanted to give up. Right. But I think it was that mindset that is like, I'm not going to give up. It's half full. I don't know how this book's going to come out, but it really was something that didn't happen over a 12 or 15 month period. It was really over a 10-year plus period.
Well, it came out great, Paul. And while you may not have gotten that book tour, I'll bet you never thought you were going to get booked on the Scaling Success podcast. But here you are.
When I found out about this today, buddy, I was like, I am so excited to get on with Sean on a Friday afternoon.
That's right.
Mostly because it's too cold to golf. But other than that, it was awesome.
Well, I do think it's great, and I highly recommend it to our listeners. I mentioned it up front, but it's called Selling the Cloud. I really do think it's an amazing kind of prescriptive playbook for entrepreneurs and sales leaders that have found that product market fit and are really looking for the cheat codes on how to scale a sales organization and avoid mistakes of others. I mean, I always think there's a lot of people out there with experiences, and you're wise to seek them out and leverage their experiences. So, Paul, thank you so much for writing the book. I've learned a lot from it, and I encourage all our listeners. It's always fun catching up with you, Paul, and look forward to hopefully getting together in person at some point here in the near future.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.